Welcome to Logistics Unplugged. My name is Brian Blaylock, and I'm your host, and I'm happy to jump in today to all things logistics. So let's pull back the curtain, take a look under the hood, and have a great discussion. I'm very excited to be joined by my good friend Jonathan Swart, the Senior Director of 3PL for Blue Grace Logistics. Jonathan, thanks for coming back.
I appreciate having me back on.
Absolutely. So they haven't kicked either one of us off yet, so let's just keep going. I know, Jonathan, we're still part of our summer shipping series, and we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about some of the impacts that we see, and we're going to get to play a little bit Nostradamus today because we are recording this in all transparency to the audience. We're recording this before we get to DOT Blitz Week, before we get to Memorial Day, before we get to July 4th, and you're probably listening to it a few minutes thereafter. So we're really going to get to test your ability to predict the future because we're going to do a quick follow-up and we're going to know how good he did. So Jonathan, summer shipping series, all the pressure's on you. So I'm going to let you relax for a minute before we get into the pressure, and we're going to talk about a few fun things, okay?
Let me go get my crystal ball out of my office so I can make sure that these predictions are going to be correct.
Just dust it off, buddy. Dust it off. It'll be fine.
Yeah.
You've done it before. You can do it again. Pull through.
If I was going to look at it, history would say that this is the period of time at which you can get a catalyst in the market, right? So you look at some of the seasonality that happens in the Southeast, really driven around the floral push and some of the seasonal commodities that, in Central Florida, South Georgia. Holidays have played a big timing into that this year, with Easter being late and Mother's Day being a little early. You kind of get some of the seasonal commodities around Easter, poinsettias, some of the floral that goes along with that, followed quickly by Mother's Day. And we've seen a little bit of tightness in the Southeast, right? I wouldn't say anything abnormally seasonal, right? Yes, seasonal commodities are hitting. That's volume that isn't typical to that region, right? And that's why we have seasonality in trucking. That's why companies like Blue Grace exist, right?
Absolutely.
We have to be able to manage that for our customer partners. We've seen a little uptick in the Southeast, which I think people are optimistic about. Quickly shifting to some of the next events that can act as that catalyst is, you go to your West Coast or kind of the grilling season type summer events.
Love that name, grilling season.
It's there. I know we get
lunchtime too, Jonathan. You're hurting me.
That's right. We get a little spoiled in Florida, being able to grill 12 months of the year outside.
Absolutely.
For the people that grew up north of I-40, that's not always a thing. Hard to cold smoke cheese down here in Florida, though.
That's valid.
Yeah,
that's fair.
So there's some trade-offs, right? But back on track, you go DOT Safety Blitz, Safety Week, however you want to frame it. That being 2 weeks prior to Memorial Day, leading into kind of that summer push. Little bit up in the air on whether we're going to see those events drive some capacity tightness in the network. There's obviously a lot of other things happening that will impact North American surface trans, but those are really the big events that we look at. Everything as it stands today would tell us, yeah, we'll see some normal seasonality, but are we going to see demand all of a sudden have a 25% increase and, route guides start to deteriorate? I would say probably not if I was going to get out my crystal ball.
There's your first bet, folks.
Yeah. If I have to give it a confidence on it, I'd have to think about it a little bit. But just based on what we're seeing, it's interesting economically as you see different analysts come out with contrary views, right? At some point in time, if you say the same thing long enough, you're eventually right. But
or you make it become true.
One or the others. But you look at it, and we take a look at credit card debt, new home builds. We saw a very acute spike in flatbed as some of the tariff news was hitting, and our largest sources of lumber being Canada and imports. You saw flatbed demand tick up, whether that was people pulling inventory forward to avoid it, whether it was the actual new home builds coming into the market, whatever those things are. But there is a lot of acute reaction to some of the geopolitical stuff that is going on, and how that affects North American surface trans can vary greatly based on the way the consumers in the market or the kind of larger manufacturers are reacting to those. those things.
For sure. And we've said it before, Jonathan, it almost doesn't matter what we think about it. It matters what we do about it, right? So regardless of the circumstances that are in front of us, when things are uncertain, we have to try to grab the best certainty that we can and make the best decisions, whether it's mode change, whether it's timing, whether, like you mentioned, pulling inventory forward, all the decisions that are made from the shipper side and from us, their partner, to make sure that we keep things landing when they're supposed to land, getting to the people they're supposed to get to. And we've said it before, as we look around this room, everything in here got here on a truck, right?
That's right.
And we talked before we started today, Jonathan, you talked a little bit about, I'm going to pull you away from the events, the time-centered events, but I am going to talk about some of the things that have now happened and what you're seeing as a result. I know that there's been an executive order on driver language regulation. You'll probably say that way more correct than I just did. But talk to me a little bit about that and talk to me about what you think that is going to create.
Yeah. So I'll start off by saying it's not a new requirement, right? Drivers in the U.S. have always been required to have proficient English, right? To be able to read road signs, communicate with DOT, law enforcement. So that's not necessarily a new requirement. If you read through the executive order mandating the English language proficiency, you'll see that referenced, right? References back to the original laws that required that. Those have been loosely enforced for the most part. You're seeing the states take different stances on it, right? Some are going to be more firm. Some are going to kind of keep things as is. Yet to be seen what that's really going to do to capacity. I think all of us could agree that I don't think capacity tightness is going to be driven by a demand side event, right? We're seeing a lot of economic indicators look a little bit bleak, not to be all gloom and doom. Try to stay optimistic. So if any tightness is going to be driven here, it's probably going to be from the supply side, which would be taking drivers out of the market. Nobody's ever really a fan of that, but we have to balance that with safety and the general public. So, it can be challenging at times, and you're seeing some states come out, Colorado, Arkansas, having a firm stance one way or the other.
Right.
So it's a little bit to be determined. I don't think we will really see those impacts. You think about the new driver entrance into the market, they're not that significant, right? Most of your large capacity providers are trying to drive utilization. They're not necessarily adding capacity at this point in time. So now we're really talking about what does it mean from a turnover standpoint, drivers leaving the industry and balancing the new entrants. And so I think that's where we're going to see it. So you could see the impacts of that executive order be delayed, 8, 10, 12 months down the road.
Okay.
So we're going to keep an eye on it and make sure that our partners, to the best of our ability, are in compliance with that, right? We take care of that on a contracting standpoint. But so it'll be interesting, but it's another kind of geopolitical event that don't necessarily know how exactly people are going to react to it, right? So we're going to keep an eye on it. I don't necessarily think we're going to feel any short-term effects just based on where we're at from a supply side on the capacity. There's a decent amount of it right now. It's not exactly constrained, unless we're talking about some of the seasonally impacted areas, but that's more market-driven than it is macro capacity environment.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna put a pin, but I'm going to come back to it in a minute when we talk about whether it's regulations or events on the ground, the whole geopolitical impact to supply chains, and again, our need to be able to flex to whatever those results happen to be. But we did talk about timeliness and impact and a few other things, and I want to talk about some other kinds of timeliness here, Mr. Swart. I know that you've been in a big rush. You had this whirlwind 10-year engagement to your lovely wife to be, and I understand that after 10 years, you guys are going to rush and get a couple of things done. One of which was your bachelor trip.
Yeah,
and I know that you went to. I really have some questions about this. You went to Buenos Aires, and you also went to something that scares me to death called the Parana River Delta. Is that right? Did I get that right?
It is.
Why are you near something called the Piranha River?
You know, me and my friends as kids had this trip planned forever, right? It's one of those, kind of dream outdoor activities that you think about when you're in middle school. And now, since I'm the last one to get engaged of all my friends, it's like, well, you're up. We're gonna have to use this as the excuse to make this trip happen.
This is it.
And so I was talking to Brooke, and I was like, hey, I'm trying to get these dates ironed out, yada, yada, yada. What do you think about a wedding date? And she looked at me dead in the eyes and said, it's taken you 10 years to get to this spot. Now you're going to put me on a timeline. So I took that as a cue to just move forward with our trip plans. But we had a blast. A lot of great restaurants, checked a couple boxes, saw more than one anaconda.
Wow.
And when it's 12 feet long and our guide says, well, that's just a baby, makes you a little nervous.
That makes me nervous just hearing about it.
Yeah.
Did you get into this Piranha River?
I did. I waded through it about chest deep, which was a little concerning, especially doing it in the dark. So
this is getting worse.
Yeah. We all returned home. No snake bites or spider bites, thankfully. So
and no piranha nibbles?
No. Caught a couple piranhas on the river.
Wow.
Which was interesting.
So do you wear piranha-proof clothing when you go into the Piranha River, or you just hope that they're not hungry or that you taste bad?
Correct. I'd say maybe I taste a little sour, so they left me alone.
Just got to make sure you eat food they don't like before you get in the river.
That's
like
right.
It.
Yeah.
And I know you did a little bit of hunting while you were there.
Yes, we did.
And you shared with me that we had an international event there. We had you against the Brits in an international hunt off.
There was. It was an interesting experience. The lodge that we ended up staying at, they're fantastic. We've used them for a couple other things in the past, and so there was a group from the UK in, and they were a little bit older than me and my friends, and but very formal sport, right?
It means they were my age.
But
I am, however, not formal. But tell me about this formal wear.
They have some strong tradition around upland game hunting and bird hunting and things of that nature.
Okay.
So, they're dressed to the nines, and then here comes my group of friends from central Arkansas, northern Minnesota, central North Dakota.
So you guys were the hillbilly version of this wardrobe.
That's right, but there was a little bit of competition there, and I would say we fared pretty well. Maybe a little unfair because two of my friends are shot competitively, trap and skeet.
Okay.
And a couple of them have won some awards, so maybe not exactly a good representation, but if it wasn't a competition on their side, it definitely was on ours.
So you knew you were in a competition whether they did or not.
Correct.
Well, listen, if you're going to show up with that kind of uniform on and you're going to come out that far to do this, you should probably know you are in a little bit of a competition, right?
That's right. And then later in the evening after dinner, there was a little bit back and forth with the speaker, with the sound system in the lodge. And so we had some fun, but I don't necessarily think that those guys had the same taste in music as us.
I got to hear a little bit about this. Was this British invasion versus traditional U.S.?
Maybe they were more 70s and 80s hits, right? We were a little bit later than that. We crossed the 80s, so, there's a little crossover there, but it went from Earth, Wind, and Fire, Fleetwood Mac, Elton John, Toto, Tom Petty, so we ran the gamut. It was a lot of fun, though. Turned out to be a little too late in the evening, though.
They always pull their Beatles trump card out on you at the end, don't they?
They do, right? And they save that card until about 3 a.m. in the morning.
So. Oh, man. Now, that's cheating, right?
Yeah.
When you always get, you do have Elvis.
We do.
You could always bring Elvis into the fire.
We did not pull that card.
How did you?
I don't know.
Oh,
missed it. Should have been there, Brian.
I know. Next time I will be there. I'll have my piranha-proof gear on when I do, however, though.
Yeah.
And I will not be wearing the fancy clothes. I will be in the hillbilly attire, just so you know.
All right, fair.
So congratulations to
Thank
you
you
on that. Shout out to Brooke. We appreciate you letting him sneak away so we could get a good story out of it. And I'm excited for both of you.
Thank you.
And we'll jump right back in. We started talking a little bit about some of the things that have happened with regulations, and like you mentioned, the executive order for the driver language requirements. That's not new; it's newly enforced.
Correct.
That's more the conversation. You still have a fair amount of confidence that not a tremendous amount of impact. What about we've really made efforts on cross border, and we see a lot of need for that with some of the repositioning of freight. Do you see more impact potentially there, or
Yeah.
on balance, or are we talking about the same issue either way?
No, I think that you're going to continue to see investment in nearshoring. Those things don't happen overnight, right? You don't manufacture something in Southeast Asia or abroad and then all of a sudden wake up one morning and say, hey, you know what, for a supply chain or to avoid, these tariffs or build some redundancy in our supply chain, just wake up one morning and say, we're going to manufacture this somewhere else, Canada, Mexico, the U.S. Those things take some time to plant investment, manufacturing capacity, raw material sourcing. Those things are all going to be impacted. And so, yes, do we have an acute reaction to some of the newly announced tariffs or some of the uncertainty around what's going to happen with global trade? But we are seeing it accelerate that trend of companies and manufacturers putting out press releases, hey, we're going to invest in Central Mexico, we're going to invest in the U.S. and Canada. And so how that is going to impact the North American surface transportation, those are impacts that we're going to see 12, 24, 36 months down the road. And so it's just understanding how those networks are going to change. And one of the things I love about the industry is it's still very much supply and demand driven.
Sure, absolutely.
And so everything that you think about from a typical, lane supply and demand on the origin and destination side and how it impacts pricing and how it impacts capacity flow, right? Those networks are built over time. I'll revert back to some of the previous examples that we've used is, when you and I were growing up, you didn't buy strawberries in the dead of winter in North Dakota, right? Like you just didn't. They weren't in season. Whoever did the grocery shopping in your house wasn't going and able to come home with that stuff. That's changed a lot over the years, right? Now you can buy strawberries in the grocery store 12 months out of the year. That had changed the dynamic of the temp control network, right? In the past, it was, produce is very, very seasonal. It's isolated to certain commodities. Well, now you can build an entire network around produce commodities, right? They ship 12 months a year. Some of the origins change. We may be seeing some of those same effects as you look at more nearshoring and you look at more manufacturing in Mexico. Is that going to increase the demand for northbound capacity? Probably, but that's not anything new. That's been continuously growing. Does it change some of the southbound dynamic if manufacturing returns to the U.S.? Yeah, probably.
Right.
You could go down the laundry list within the automotive sector about, how different parts on a car travel through different countries for assembly for certain parts, right? And that's one of the reasons why automotive has probably been targeted a little heavier on the tariff side is just because the sheer number of import, export, and touches on the different components that go into building our vehicles it's astronomical. If you were to look at a single part on a car and see how many different countries it's traveled through from raw materials to certain parts of manufacturing to assembly. And so, unraveling that after how many ever years of running in a certain network, it's going to have some impacts.
Sure.
That crystal ball doesn't look that far into the future to be able to tell exactly what those impacts are. But, if anything is for certain, it's that change and adaptability is something that you have to have in this industry.
Without question, you talk about the modern supply chain and understanding that. I think you and I both agree on this, Jonathan. People are going to buy things.
Yeah.
That's going to happen. It's where they come from that might be a little bit different. So I'm going to use two words that no one would ever describe me personally with, which is agile and flexible.
Maybe a couple of years ago.
That's a little bit in the rear view there, but that's something that needs to be true for supply chains, that agility, that flexibility. We don't care how it gets there. It just has to get there, right? So,
and I think if there was lessons learned, and not to always have to go back and reference kind of that COVID period, right? But
Sure.
you saw that big bullwhip effect, right? So raw materials there's uncertainty around raw materials. Redundancies aren't necessarily built the best for a global pandemic, right? Like nobody plans that, right? If anybody was planning that, they probably had a better crystal ball than I did. But you saw all of a sudden this rush to gather so much inventory and order your raw materials from a couple different vendors because you didn't know about the reliability. And then all of a sudden, those orders come to fruition, delayed or not, and you get this big backlog of inventory, raw materials, things for manufacturing that you need, and it just has this domino effect in the reversed fashion as kind of the run up and so I think if there's lessons to be learned, it's, let's be more cognizant of the way that we're going to manage this, right? Nobody wants to go through that bullwhip, right? You have, a lot of sunk cost in inventory. You're probably over on some things, short on some things. And so there were a lot of challenges coming out of that post-COVID period for supply chains to react to and land on sourcing, right? If sourcing comes back online or this or that, and you have that preferred vendor and you want to make the switch back, how do you balance all that and make those changes? And what is that actual impact to a landed cost within the supply chain? And I think you will see people be more calculated, or companies, and we will give guidance on how to be more precise with those decisions, because at some point in time, chaos breaks loose and it's we got to make sure we're covered. But the overreaction sometimes can be just as negative as being not prepared. So,
yep, you're absolutely right. And I like being able to use this expression since you're sitting here with me, Jonathan. But in the event that your supply chain is going through that, I know a guy. So he happens to be sitting here with me today. So, Jonathan, we touched a lot of good topics. I do want to take one more super important one before you get out of here. Mm-hmm. And I know that I've actually done this with you several times, and I've done a few with the oats part of Hall & Oates, which is your partner Will there. And the last time he and I spoke, we went through our top 5 summer songs since we were in summer season for shipping. So I'm going to put you on the spot, and I'm going to get your top 5 either summer or grilling songs, whichever road you want to go down with that. And you've been talking about music all morning with your friends from England, so I know you got to have 5 that you can pull up quick. Let's hit it.
You know what? I'm going to go back to the 70s and 80s, and I'm going to keep things a little bit light. Probably get, these are banners on a playlist, so I'm going to go with Sweet Home Alabama.
Nice.
I'm going to go Have You Seen the Rain?
Ooh.
Yeah.
Very nice.
It's a classic summer song. Jesse's Girl.
Jesse's Girl. Mm-hmm. A little Springfield there.
That's right.
I like it.
Eye of the Tiger.
I love that.
Oh, yeah. Me too.
Absolutely.
And then I'm going to round it out with Three Little Birds.
3 Little Birds.
Bob Marley.
How do I not know that?
Are you kidding? If you heard it, you would know.
Should I make him sing a note?
No, do not do that. You will not like that.
For the benefit of the audience, I'm going to go research this on my own time, but we've got a great list. We've had a great time today. I appreciate every single time I get to sit down and talk with you, Jonathan, especially when we get to do it for the folks. So thank you, folks, for listening. We'll see you next Tuesday.